Welcome everyone. So far, we have been able to discuss the reading and writing standards. Today, we're going to start speaking more about the language standards and what that looks like. So, I want you to first think, ask yourself, how often are you teaching language standards in your classroom? The language standards are how we choose to develop academic English within our students. Now, some advocates of equity do find that this approach can read as biased or even racist because it lifts up a specific kind of language. This is a complicated and nuanced issue, and it is definitely an issue that is worth further conversation. But there is a place in the classroom for academic English, as well as a student's home or variant language, which we'll talk about a lot this week, as well as what that looks like when it comes to speaking with language with our students. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start with a quote that is literally going to frame the entire session, so I can get a loud and proud voice to be able to talk about this quote on the screen. Thank you so much for that loud and proud voice. This quote comes from the book Other People's Children, Cultural Conflict in the Classroom by Lisa Delpit. So I wanted this to frame our session because I want us to get our minds wrapped around this concept. We are able to honor a student's home language, but also still give them the tools and the skills to build a strong academic English. We want to make sure that we are not extinguishing a student's home language, but making sure that we are adding additional language to their repertoire. Now, what does that look like? We're going to look deeper at that with how the language standards progress, and that is something we'll be focusing on with language progressive skills. So you received the ecosystems link. I don't want you looking at it just yet, but I want you to be clear inside that link. There's a clip, there is a handout titled Language Progressive Skills. We're not addressing that yet, but we will in just a moment. I just want you to have that nearby. So when you're thinking about language progressive skills, you want to consider giving students access to academic English is really the role of the language standards. Just like the foundational skills of reading, it is important that students, in order to achieve equity, are being explicitly taught the language standards as well. Inside of your packet, the progressive language skills, is a Common Core chart. This shows what the specific structures of our language are introduced and where they are practiced over time. That handout is going to be a resource in just a moment when I have you do a quick shoulder discussion. That link, that handout, coupled with the 2 questions that you see on the screen, in just a moment, I'm going to ask for you to discuss with the person next to you and how it relates to your own classroom right now. Those questions are, to what extent are you introducing, reinforcing, and practicing these standards where they are expected? Number 2, what may practicing this in a non-threatening, real communicative context look like in your circumstance? Using the progressive language skills handout, as well as these questions as guidance, go ahead and speak to the person right next to you who will share out forward. Awesome, so as I was looking around, as I was listening, I was hearing certain trends, and one that's really consistent is thinking about being intentional about how you're assessing these skills. Because if you are not choosing to be intentional with like anything else in the classroom, it'll be confusing of what you're tracking, you won't be able to see the progress, but it also be confusing for students if they should be using academic English versus their home language variant, and you don't want that to be a confusion to take away the understanding. So, we're gonna get even deeper here, because what kind of language are we speaking about? There are several different levels of language, and I think we all know that as teachers. And we're gonna take a look at those today more explicitly. So, you can see on the screen, you can see in your handout, there are 3 different tiers of academic English that we address. Starting with tier 1, everyday speech and basic vocabulary. This is often sight words with one meaning. It's the entry to English proficiency. It is some of the first words that people are able to grasp and hold on to when they are learning English. That is tier 1. Tier 2. This one takes it up a level. It's more intermediate proficiency. It is general academic words required for English proficiency. Academic words is what makes this key. more likely to appear in text than in speech. So you're going to see this likely in a textbook more often than you'll hear it in conversations with other students. The language tends to be subtle, or there are precise ways to say relatively simple things. For instance, a tier 2 language, typically you would say a word like walk. That's more of a tier 1 word. But to say the word saunter immediately ups the rigor of it, takes it more to intermediate, and also pushes more context necessary to understand what the word really means, because you don't hear it all the time. It's a word you may see written, but it's not heard in conversation. Tier 3, and this piece, this is where it gets tough. The tier 3 piece is heavily academic related. It's specific and technical, required for English proficiency. It is key to communicating concepts, and it is more common in informational text. Tier 2 and 3 are both more common in informational text. Even more specifically for tier 3, you need a ton of context to often understand words. So when you're thinking subject specific, words like lava and aorta, they're science words. These are words that we can immediately recall now as adults. But if you think about it, in order to understand what lava means, you must know volcano. In order to know aorta, you must know what heart is. So these are the levels. This is the level that is most challenging to achieve, but also demonstrates full English proficiency. Just as a note here, if you work a lot with English language learners, tier 2 is where we're going to be focusing. But if you're working a lot with English language learners, tier 2 is just intermediate proficiency and does not take them to full proficiency, which is necessary for English language learner. We're going to continue diving into these different tiers. I just want to make sure we have this language that was necessary so that we're all on the same page. So let's continue going deeper with our discussions. In a moment, you're going to be able to talk amongst yourselves about these 2 questions. This is all the background I'm going to give you. We're starting with just this piece, your background knowledge of your own classroom and how you presented these pieces. These are the 2 questions I'm going to ask to guide your conversation, your discussion. When should students use academic English, in your opinion? And what is the place of a student's native language or variance in the classroom? We are going to come back together to discuss full group, so please make sure as you're discussing that you're getting to both questions. Go ahead and talk. And I'm going to ask us to come back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thanks so much. So as I was circulating, I was really looking for some key points, and I was hearing some from over here, and I was hearing some from over here. I'm going to share out some, so feel free to jump back in if you would, if there are more you want to add, or if there's something you want to build on to. So thinking about when students should use academic language. This is often dependent, on the lesson. I was hearing that as we were going around. Absolutely depends on the lesson. There are some moments where you're not pushing students to speak perfect academic English, but there are moments like where if you're pushing certain academic English standards, if you are teaching new vocabulary, you want to make sure that even if the home language is the entry point, especially for new vocabulary, that you are still ending the lesson with students taking away the academic English portion of the new vocabulary. You want to stress that. And as far as the home language, peer-to-peer conversations, absolutely. You don't want to take that from students being able to interact with one another. But surprisingly, you can also find, maybe not surprisingly, you can also find uses for the home language inside other pieces of English. There's more informal writing that home language absolutely should be used in when it comes to dialogue, when it comes to things like poetry. You don't want to squash the creativity of that, but definitely absolutely encourage it. So now that you've been able to talk about this a bit with the people around you, we're going to take a look at a video. This video is from a veteran facilitator. And in the video, you'll hear her speak a bit about what you just discussed, but she's going to go in a bit more detail and give a little more background about the why behind this, why it's done. So as you're listening, please feel free to take notes, because once we come back full group, these are the guiding questions we're going to be discussing. I'll read them aloud to the room, and then we'll go right into the video. How does Mariama's message lift gleam in the classroom? When should students use academic language? What is the place of a student's native language or variance in the classroom? What are the implications for planning and teaching? As you're watching the video, please make sure you're taking notes as we go and getting out any key thoughts that connect to these questions. Are there any questions before we begin the video? Let's watch. All right, we're gonna go right into this full group, so I hope you took great notes as we were going through. I'm gonna actually start with hands, and then we can have more of a hands-down discussion about this process. So, just starting with question 1, what are some things that you were hearing that connected with you to this point? How does Miriam's message gleam in the classroom? Yes, it helps to own academic English, to access all areas of life, absolutely. What else? Looking at academic English as its own variant, absolutely. One that really sticks out, the limits of your language are the limits of your world. I'm gonna say that again. The limits of your language are the limits of your world. You don't want to limit our students in any capacity. Academic English helps to break down some of those limits, some of those limitations. Number 2, when your students use academic language, this may feel a little more obvious, or maybe it doesn't, but some of the common trends I was hearing is, and I love the use of this language, the tier 2 and tier 3 levels of language should definitely be encouraged for use of academic English. We talked about how informational texts are very linked to tier 2 and tier 3, and that is something that should be very much pushed, especially when it comes to the vocabulary pieces of academic English and academic language. Student variants, a lot of what we said the last time about poetry and about dialogue, absolutely true. But something that's newer for students right now, and I think they're very interested in it, are things like blogging and journaling. But journaling isn't as new, but blogging is way newer for students, and they should definitely be encouraged to use their voice, because that is an outlet for students as well. And we want to make sure you're not taking that from students in any capacity, as well as things like short stories. It is okay for students to use their voice and their home language when it comes to those pieces, as well as written or spoken language on occasion. So as far as the planning and teaching, I would say just like anything, if you are not choosing to plan it out, it's not going to be executed the way you want it to be. It's not going to be done consistently the way you need it to be. This takes conscious thought, especially if it's not something already in your practice, but the benefits behind this are absolutely worth it. And we're going to speak more about that in our call to action as we start to wrap up on this one piece. So on the screen, there's really powerful calls to action. I'm going to give the room a second just to read it over. And just holding up a finger on which one resonates the most with you. 1, 2, 3, 4. The one that you know that you really need to focus on. Yeah, absolutely. All these pieces are key, but as a call to action, I want it to be more tangible for you in your classroom, so I want you thinking about this. The language standards are an intersectionality between what you encourage, what you teach, and what you accept in your classroom. Every single one of us in this room have a passport to language right now. It is our job to make sure our students have the access to that same kind of passport, those same kind of limitless options, so that they are able to be successful in society, but also be able to move freely in instructional spaces because they're able to bounce back and forth between both. And just to name this very clearly, English language learners must be proficient in English, even though the United States does not have an official language. They must be proficient in academic English. So it is important that while we're building up academic English, that you're also not putting down the home language of other students, because that is also where they find pride, is where we find pride, in your home language, where you feel most comfortable. It's your community. So you want to be very clear that you're not using words about home language that are ignorant, it's incorrect, it's wrong, because that can feel personal to a student, and it will definitely affect the way they show up in your room and in your space, and what they're able to learn from you in that moment. It is also true that economic success in the United States is tied to proficiency in academic English. The success of students economically is tied to the proficiency of academic English. We are accountable for making sure our students have access to grade level specific academic English standards, so they are able to navigate and move about in this world in a way of being successful, while also not taking away their opportunities for home language, so they're not losing that personal quality of who they are. The emphasis on this moment is that you're helping students to understand using your home language is a gateway, is an entry point to improving and adding more language to your repertoire and having more access to things in this world. Thank you so much for your time today. I do hope we had some strong takeaways. Hope this will be able to come back into your classrooms with you. And feel free to stay back and ask questions if you have any.